My neighbor spent 6 straight months dumping stormwater into my backyard. And the strange part is, I never yelled at him, never called a lawyer, never even filed a complaint. Instead, I built something that cost less than a weekend fishing trip. And by the end of summer, he was standing on my front porch asking for help. Now, before anybody decides I was some kind of landscaping genius, trust me, I wasn't. At the beginning of this story, I was just a guy trying to enjoy the backyard my wife and I had worked years to afford. My name is Ryan Mercer. I'm 46 years old, and I live in a small subdivision outside Fairview, Tennessee. It's the kind of neighborhood where people smile when they drive by, where Christmas decorations stay up a little too long, and where everybody acts friendly enough until money, property lines, or pride get involved. My wife Emily and I bought our house almost 13 years ago. Back then, our daughters were still little girls running around with scraped knees and popsicle-stained shirts. The backyard was what sold us. It wasn't huge, but it had character. A gentle slope, a couple mature oak trees, enough room for cookouts, family gatherings, and the occasional attempt at gardening that usually ended with me admitting I had no idea what I was doing. For years, everything was fine. Then the house behind us sold. The new owner was a guy named Trevor Collins. The first time I met him, he seemed perfectly normal. Mid-30s, expensive sunglasses, spotless pickup truck, always talking about investments, property values, and home upgrades. He wasn't rude exactly, just the kind of guy who treated every conversation like he was pitching a business deal. Within weeks, he started renovating. Contractors came and went almost daily. New patio, new retaining walls, new landscaping, new gutters. Everything looked expensive. One Saturday morning, I was grilling burgers when Trevor wandered over near the fence. "Putting a lot of money into the place," I said. He smiled. "Gotta protect the investment." At the time, I thought nothing of it. A few weeks later, we got one of those Tennessee summer storms. You know the kind. The sky turns almost green. Thunder shakes the windows. Rain falls so hard it looks like somebody dumped an ocean out of a bucket. The next morning, I noticed a patch of standing water near the rear corner of my yard. Nothing dramatic, just a puddle. I figured the ground was saturated. No big deal. A couple days later, it dried up. Then another storm came. Same puddle, only bigger. This time it stayed for nearly 4 days. The grass started turning darker. My dog Cooper avoided walking through it. When I stepped into the area, my boots sank deep enough to make that awful sucking sound wet soil makes. That's when I started paying attention. A few days later, I was mowing the lawn when I noticed something sticking out behind Trevor's new patio. A white PVC pipe, about 4 inches wide, pointed directly toward my property. At first, I assumed it was temporary. Maybe a contractor forgot to finish something. Maybe it was part of a drainage project still under construction. I gave him the benefit of the doubt, because that's what adults are supposed to do. Then one afternoon, another storm rolled in. I happened to be standing in the kitchen, looking out the back window. Rain hammered the patio. Water rushed across the concrete. And suddenly that pipe came alive. I'm not exaggerating when I say it looked like a fire hose. A concentrated stream blasted out of the pipe and shot directly into my backyard. I stood there frozen, coffee mug in my hand, watching water carve a channel through my grass, watching my yard become the place his runoff was being sent. The whole thing was almost impressive from an engineering standpoint. His patio stayed dry. His lawn stayed usable. His problem disappeared, and somehow it reappeared in my yard. The next morning, I walked over and knocked on his door. Trevor answered holding a travel mug and wearing gym clothes. "Hey," I said, "got a minute?" "Sure." I pointed toward the back of the property. "That drainage pipe is sending a lot of water into my yard." He blinked, then shrugged. Water flows downhill. I remember staring at him for a second. Not because of what he said, because of how casually he said it. Like gravity itself had personally signed off on the situation. "Yeah," I replied, "but this isn't natural runoff. It's being directed." Another shrug. "The contractor said it's standard." "Maybe, but I've got standing water for days after every storm." He took a sip of coffee. "If there's an issue, talk to the contractor." Then he started backing toward the doorway. Conversation over. Door closed. And just like that, I realized something important. The problem wasn't the water. The problem was that Trevor had found a way to keep his shoes dry, and he didn't particularly care whose yard paid the price. At the time, I still thought this could be solved peacefully. I had no idea that over the next few months, I'd become far more familiar with drainage systems, county regulations, and human nature than I ever wanted to be. And honestly, the water was only the beginning. The funny thing about problems is that sometimes they arrive all at once, and sometimes they drip into your life slowly enough that you almost convince yourself they're normal. This one dripped, storm after storm, week after week. Every time the rain came, that pipe woke up, and every time it woke up, another piece of my backyard died. The grass near the fence started turning yellow, then brown. Mosquitoes showed up in numbers I'd never seen before. Emily stopped sitting on the patio in the evenings because she'd get eaten alive. Even Cooper seemed annoyed. The dog would walk toward the back corner, stop, stare at the muddy mess like it had personally insulted him, then turn around and head somewhere else. One evening, I was standing at the kitchen sink watching water pool again when Emily walked in carrying a basket of laundry. She looked out the window, looked at me, then looked back at the swamp forming in our yard. "You've been staring at that spot a lot lately." I laughed. "Probably more than is healthy. You gonna do something about it?" I wasn't sure how to answer, because technically I already had. I'd spoken to Trevor. I tried being reasonable. The problem was that reasonable only works when both people care. That night, I started documenting everything. Nothing dramatic. Just photos, videos, dates, rainfall amounts. I recorded storms from the kitchen window, from the patio, even from upstairs. Every video showed the same thing. Water rushed across Trevor's expensive new patio, entered the pipe, then launched directly into my yard like it had a mission. At first, I felt ridiculous doing it. A middle-aged guy filming rainstorms. But after a few weeks, I had enough footage to tell the entire story without saying a word. One Saturday morning, my neighbor across the street, an older retired firefighter named Hank, saw me walking around the backyard with my phone. "You making a documentary?" he yelled. I laughed. Something like that. He came over later with a cup of coffee and stood beside me near the fence. We watched the muddy area. He nodded toward Trevor's property. "That pipe causing all this?" "Looks that way." Hank scratched his beard. "Funny thing." "What?" "Before the renovation, that corner never held water." That stuck with me, because Hank had lived there nearly 20 years. Longer than either of us. If anybody knew how the properties naturally drained, it was him. The next major storm arrived a few days later. I filmed everything again. When it ended, I grabbed a yardstick from my garage and pushed it into the deepest part of the standing water. 2¼ inches. Not enough to make the evening news. Definitely enough to ruin a lawn. Definitely enough to make a backyard unusable. That night, Emily found me sitting at the dining room table reviewing videos. "You building a case?" I leaned back. "I don't know." She sat beside me. For a few seconds, we watched the footage together. The pipe, the water, the puddle, the same cycle over and over. Then she said something that stayed with me. "It's not really about the water anymore." I looked at her. "What do you mean?" She shrugged. "It's about respect." And somehow that hit harder than anything else. Because she was right. The water was frustrating. The dismissal was what bothered me. The shrug, the indifference, the assumption that my problem didn't matter because it wasn't happening on his property. A few nights later, I started researching. County websites, stormwater regulations, property drainage rules. The kind of reading that can make a person question every life decision that led them to spending a Friday night looking through government PDFs. Most of it was boring. Then I found something interesting. Very interesting. Buried deep inside a county drainage document was a simple statement. Property owners could not collect and concentrate stormwater runoff in a way that discharged directly onto neighboring property. I read it twice, then a third time. Then I printed it. Suddenly that pipe looked a lot different. I wasn't imagining things. There was a distinction between natural runoff and concentrated discharge. Rainwater spreading naturally downhill was one thing. Collecting it through a system and firing it into someone else's yard was something else entirely. For the first time, I seriously considered filing a complaint. The county could investigate. An inspector could come out. The issue might get resolved. But another part of me hesitated. Not because Trevor deserved protection. Because once you start involving officials, things rarely get simpler. People take sides. Neighbors stop speaking. Every interaction becomes awkward. And honestly, I didn't want a war. I wanted my backyard back. A few days later, something happened that changed everything. I was walking along the fence line after work when I started paying attention to the actual grade of the land. Not the obvious parts. the subtle parts, the inches nobody notices. I grabbed a tape measure, then borrowed a level from my garage. For the next hour, I probably looked completely insane. A grown man measuring dirt while mosquitoes attacked him. But eventually a pattern emerged. Our properties weren't shaped the way I'd assumed. My backyard dipped slightly near the fence. That's where the water collected. But farther down the line, near the side of Trevor's lot, the elevation dropped again. Lower than my yard. Not dramatically. Just enough. A thought entered my mind, then immediately made me uncomfortable. I walked the fence again. Measured again. The numbers didn't change. If the water hitting my property could be prevented from pooling, if it were allowed to spread naturally, gravity would take over. And gravity didn't particularly care whose name was on the deed. The next day I called someone. His name was Victor Ramirez. Local landscaper. Great reputation. He'd built a retaining wall for my brother years earlier. When he arrived, he spent almost 30 minutes silently examining the yard. Then he crouched near the muddy section and grabbed a handful of soil. Water squeezed between his fingers. He stood up, looked toward Trevor's house, spotted the pipe immediately, then laughed softly. Well, what? Now I understand. I told him everything. The conversations, the flooding, the videos, the county regulations. Victor listened carefully. Then he asked a simple question. What exactly do you want? I want my yard protected. You looking for revenge? No. And surprisingly, I meant it. I wasn't interested in revenge. At least, not the Hollywood version. I didn't want damage. I didn't want conflict. I wanted the problem to stop being mine. Victor nodded, then grabbed a notepad from his truck. A few minutes later, he showed me a sketch. At first glance, it looked harmless. Decorative even. A raised planting bed running along the fence. Stone edging. Native grasses. Dark mulch. Something homeowners associations practically put on postcards. But hidden inside that pretty design was something else. A compacted berm. A solid barrier. Not huge. Not ugly. Just enough to stop concentrated water from crashing into my lawn. I stared at the drawing, then looked back toward the fence. Victor followed my gaze. Neither of us said what we were both thinking. Eventually he smiled. Gravity's gonna decide the rest. I smiled too, because for the first time in months, I could finally see a solution. And somewhere deep down, I had a feeling Trevor wasn't going to enjoy where that solution led. The project took 2 days. Victor's crew showed up early on a Thursday morning and worked quietly. No heavy machinery. No dramatic construction site. Just a few guys with wheelbarrows, shovels, stone, and a plan. By Friday afternoon, the transformation was complete. If you didn't know what you were looking at, you'd think we'd simply upgraded the landscaping. The stone edging looked clean. The ornamental grasses softened the fence line. Fresh mulch gave everything a polished look. It was probably the nicest section of the entire backyard. But underneath the pretty exterior sat a compacted berm built for one purpose: to stop my lawn from becoming someone else's drainage solution. 3 days later, the weather forecast showed a severe storm system moving through the area. I remember checking the radar more often than I checked my email that day. Not because I was worried, because I was curious. Around 6 in the evening, the sky darkened. Thunder rolled across the neighborhood. The first sheets of rain arrived, and like some strange ritual that had become part of my life, I found myself standing at the kitchen window, coffee in hand, watching, waiting. The storm intensified. Water rushed across Trevor's patio. The gutters overflowed. The familiar stream raced toward the pipe. Then it happened. The pipe fired up exactly like it always had. A concentrated blast of water shot toward my property. Only this time the ending was different. The stream slammed into the berm. Instead of carving a trench through my grass, it spread sideways. Flattened. Lost its force. For a moment the water seemed almost confused. Then gravity took over. Slowly, steadily, the runoff began traveling along the fence line, searching for the lowest point, finding it, and continuing exactly where the land naturally wanted it to go, toward the side yard Trevor had never paid much attention to. I stood there silently. No feast bumping, no celebration, no smog green, just quiet observation. Months of frustration disappeared in less than 10 minutes. When the storm finally passed, I grabbed a flashlight and walked outside. My lawn was wet. Normal wet. Healthy wet. Not swamp wet. Not ruined wet. For the first time all summer, There was no pond forming behind my house. The following week, another storm came. Same result. Then another. Same result again. Meanwhile, something else was changing. Trevor's side yard had become noticeably softer, muddier, less usable. Nothing catastrophic, just enough to become impossible to ignore. 10 days later, there was a knock on my front door. I already knew who it was. Trevor stood on the porch. His boots were muddy. His expression looked very different from the last time we'd spoken. Gone was the confident shrug. Gone was the casual smile. He looked frustrated, maybe even embarrassed. "Hey," he said. "Hey." For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. Then he glanced toward the backyard. My side yard's holding water. I nodded. Yeah. It never used to. There it was. The sentence I'd been waiting months to hear. Not because it felt good, because now he could finally see the problem. "I noticed you built something back there. A landscape berm." His jaw tightened slightly. Ever since then, the water's been ending up on my property. I crossed my arms, careful not to sound defensive. "I didn't send anything to your property." "What do you mean?" "I stopped it from entering mine." That landed harder than I expected. For a moment, he just stared at me, processing, replaying months of conversations in his head. Finally, he sighed. The fight seemed to leave his shoulders all at once. "Look," he said quietly, "I'm not trying to argue." I almost laughed, because that was exactly what I'd said months earlier. "I know. My side yard becoming a mess." I nodded. Mine was too. Silence. A long one. The kind that forces people to confront things they've been avoiding. Then came a question that changed everything. What would actually fix it? No sarcasm. No attitude. No excuses. Just a genuine question. And honestly, that mattered. Because at that moment, he stopped acting like my opponent and started acting like a homeowner with a problem. So I told him. A proper drainage system. A dry well. That would work. He rubbed his forehead. "That's going to cost money." I shrugged. "Probably." Another silence. Then he gave a small laugh. Not a happy laugh. The kind people make when they realize the expensive shortcut ended up costing more than the correct solution. Guess I should have handled it differently. I didn't say "I told you so." I didn't need to. Life had already done that part for me. A week later, a new contractor arrived. This crew looked a lot more thorough than the first one. They dug trenches, installed underground piping, built a gravel infiltration system, created a setup designed to absorb runoff on Trevor's property instead of exporting it to someone else's. The next major storm became the final test. I stood at the same kitchen window, the same spot where months earlier I'd watched my backyard slowly disappear under standing water. Rain poured. Water rushed off the patio, entered the pipe, then vanished underground into the new system. No canon, no estrellam, no impact zone, no swamp, just rain doing what rain is supposed to do. When the storm ended, both properties looked exactly the way they should have looked from the beginning. A few days later, I was rolling trash cans toward the curb when Trevor waved. Not the forced neighbor wave. A real one. "Looks like we finally fixed it." "Looks like it." He nodded, then said something I honestly respected. "I should have listened the first time." I smiled. "Probably." He laughed. I laughed. And that was the end of it. Or at least the end of the water. The lesson stayed longer. Because over time, I realized this story was never really about drainage. It was about boundaries. People will often push problems as far away from themselves as they can. Not always out of malice. Sometimes out of convenience. Sometimes because they genuinely don't see the consequences when somebody else is carrying them. The moment you stop absorbing those consequences, the truth becomes visible. Not louder. Not meaner. Just visible. And sometimes that's enough to force real change. Now, every time a summer storm rolls through, I still find myself standing at that kitchen window out of habit. Old routines die hard. I watch the rain fall. Watch the water disappear into the ground where it belongs. And every now and then I think about how differently this story could have ended. Maybe I should have called the county on day one. Maybe I should have fought harder. Maybe I should have escalated faster. Or maybe building that berm was exactly the right move. That's where I'd love to hear your opinion. If you were in my position, what would you have done? Would you have filed a complaint immediately? Would you have built a berm? Or do you think what I did was passive-aggressive and unfair? Drop your thoughts in the comments, because these neighborhood situations are rarely as simple as they look from the outside. And if you've ever dealt with a neighbor dispute, a property conflict, or a situation where setting a boundary changed everything, share your story below. Don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and and turn on notifications for more real stories about conflict, consequences, and the unexpected ways ordinary people solve extraordinary problems.